Last time we spoke about the massacre at Port Arthur, actions in Manchuria, and the fall of Weihaiwei. The Japanese had completely destroyed their meticulously cultivated public image when they let loose atrocities upon the Chinese at Port Arthur. Meanwhile, multiple Japanese and Chinese armies fought in Manchuria, culminating in a decisive blow at the Battle of Liang Qichao. The Japanese advance was getting ever closer to Beijing, but the event that would inflict the most serious threat to China was the battle for Weihaiwei. The survivors of the Beiyang fleet were trapped within the harbor of Weihaiwei when the Japanese snuck onto the peninsula and laid siege to the great fortified port city. The Japanese stormed the fort's guns and quickly turned them back on the Beiyang fleet before launching torpedo boats to finish the job. It was a catastrophe for the Qing Dynasty. Now the Japanese could launch offensives at their whim against Shandong province. But the war was not over. This episode is the First Sino-Japanese War Part 6, Taiwan and the End of the War. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I've just now released a rather funny episode ranking generals of the Pacific War. Also, just a friendly reminder, I myself now have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there, you can find exclusive podcasts, such as my 4-part series on General Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident, and the author of the Final War Theory. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. Japan had just captured the port city of Weihaiwei. The Japanese government publicly reported their objectives of war were not yet attained, and that the Diet was prepared to grant whatever amounts were necessary for military expenses required to finish them. Meanwhile, the Qing Court in Beijing concluded that China's military defeats had been mostly a result of the weaknesses of European weaponry. Yes, that was their conclusion. They pointed out how there was a mismatch between Chinese gunpowder, which, might I add, was inferior to that was being used in the West at this time, and their Western-purchased breech-loading rifles. From the North China Herald, we get this gem. There is a movement in Peking for the return to the use of muzzle-loading rifles and long jinggaos for arming the Chinese armies. But the Chinese arsenals before the war were unfit even for firecrackers and have been provided by unprincipled ordnance officials. This inferior gunpowder supplied to the Chinese armies in Manchuria and elsewhere since the war began had undoubtedly been one of the chief causes for which has made our soldiery appear ridiculous in the eyes of the world. The powder in the cartridges have been found either not to carry far enough, in 9 cases out of 10, or not even to explode. This sad state of affairs has been the principal cause of the hitherto astonishing panics of the Chinese soldiery whenever they are confronted by the Japanese. And so, instead of simply replacing defective powder and using modern weapons, the Qing solution to their gunpowder problem, which was the result of corrupt officials embezzling, was simply to dispose of modern weaponry and start using their old stuff. Instead of simply replacing defective powder and using modern weapons again. With the Beiyang fleet's warships destroyed or captured, Prince Gong ordered the closing of the Admiralty Board, since China no longer possessed a real navy. When he did so, they found 5 million taels missing from the account. It is alleged these funds were diverted to Empress Dowager Shixi's summer palace renovations. There was a general recognition in the West after the fall of Weihaiwei that the balance of power in the Far East had changed. China was no longer the dominant power. It was clearly Japan. The Qing Dynasty faced a horrible decision. They could negotiate a peace deal with Japan, or they could risk a coup d'etat. It was to be defeat by the hands of the Japanese, or their own hand subjects. The Manchu leadership clearly favored the former, especially since they were under the belief they could enlist some Western intervention to mitigate better peace terms on their behalf. For the Japanese, they now were trying to figure out how to make their war gains permanent. But to do so, they really had to get the Qing to capitulate before foreign intervention occurred. While Japan could defeat China, she could not handle more nations jumping into the mix, particularly the Russians in Manchuria. The Japanese public and military were demanding peace terms to meet their great achievements in the field of battle. Japanese diplomats, however, were very aware of the international diplomatic consequences of being too ambitious in their peace terms. Cooperation between the Japanese military and diplomatic leadership began to wane after the fall of Port Arthur. A week after its fall, Premier Ito Hirobumi arranged Field Marshal Yamagata Aritomo to be relieved of his command for medical reasons, but he was not sick. No, it was because Yamagata favored a direct march upon Beijing, and this made the Japanese political leadership worried he might not listen to orders telling him otherwise if he remained out in the field. They believed such a strategy would ultimately backfire, because it would collapse the Qing Dynasty, which simply would drag Western powers into the mix. As Premier Ito Hirobumi put it, "Should this happen, Japan would be negotiating peace not with China, but with the Western powers." But there is another twist to this story. Yamagata also happened to be Ito's most powerful rival, and you can only imagine how much it might displease Ito if Yamagata was the man who got to march into Beijing. Thus, Ito arranged for a different strategy. Beijing would no longer be an objective. Instead, the Second IJA hit Weihaiwei. But another, far more distant objective was also tossed onto the map, that of Taiwan. It was the belief amongst the Japanese leadership that Western powers would tolerate Japan annexing Taiwan. Always trying to emulate the great powers, Japan wanted to obtain colonies, showcasing herself to be their equal. Taking territory on the mainland of Asia was much trickier, and could butt heads with nations like Russia. But Taiwan was a lonely Qing-held asset very far away from her clutches. The strategy was extremely unpopular with the military and the Japanese public, both of whom obviously were looking forward to a foothold on the Asian mainland, and the ultimate spectacle of marching upon Beijing. In fact, the imperial family had even sent Field Marshal Prince Komatsu Akihito over to specifically grab command over the march upon Beijing. The Japanese royal family wanted one of its members to personally see the capitulation of the Qing emperor. Now that would have certainly been a hell of a spectacle to see. But most of the military and public did not understand what would occur if the Qing dynasty collapsed. By this point of the war, the IJA sought to retain the Leong Peninsula, but the Japanese politicians understood this was far too close to the Chinese capital to be tolerated. Meanwhile, the financial leaders of Japan sought, as you would imagine, a large indemnity payment. War can be expensive. So the peace demands would have three overarching demands: Taiwan, the Leong Peninsula, and a fat sum of money in indemnity payments. Now, ever since the disasters at Pyongyang and the Yalu, the British and Russian governments began to work to mediate between China and Japan. However, nothing was coming to fruition. But after the fall of Port Arthur, the Qing began to get rather desperate. Just a week after Port Arthur's fall, the Qing government sent its first peace mission to Japan. On November the 26th, the Commissioner of Customs at Tianjin, Gustave Dietring, and a journalist of the London Times named Alexander Michi arrived to Hiroshima with a letter from Liang Jang. Ito Hirobumi refused to receive the letter from Gustave Dietring because he was not properly accredited by the Qing government, so he was just simply sent away. When Kaiping fell on January the 10th, the Qing government requested a ceasefire, which the Japanese turned down. In fact, the Japanese publicly stated they would not halt hostilities even during peace talks. Thus, the war continued on. Since the first mission, if you could call it that, had failed, the Qing prepared a second one. This time the Qing hired a special advisor, the former Secretary of State to the United States, John Watson Foster. 2 commissioners were appointed, Jiang Yinhuan, a former minister to the United States, Peru, and Spain, and the current Zhang Liamen, and the second was Xiao Youlin, a previous governor over Taiwan, and the current acting governor of Hunan province. Jiang was capable of speaking English, and thus he took the head. Speaking of heads, Xiao Youlin, though a very unknown official, was rather infamous for one thing at this time. He had issued a proclamation at the beginning of the war offering 200 tael rewards for anyone who would bring the head of a Japanese officer, or 100 taels for regular soldiers presented to him. Now, if you have been listening to this series from the beginning, you can guess this age-old trick the Chinese were playing to save face. Always add some level of insult when performing negotiations. Thus, Mr. Xiao Youlin's appointment was just that, an insult and a part of a game. A game the Japanese understood. China was still trying to make her look inferior. If China had sent top-ranking diplomats, it meant that they were treating Japan as an equal, but they were not doing so. And so to this, the Japanese retaliated. They used diplomatic fine print found from European international law to rid themselves of the new delegation without breaching any rules on courtesy. They made the Chinese look ridiculous. Here is how it all went down according to the North China Herald. The 2 envoys who should be proceeding were still idling in Shanghai because they were unfurnished with proper credentials. The Japanese also asserted the United States minister in Beijing had been asked to draw up proper sets of credentials, but he was extremely late to present them, and this was simply unacceptable. According to the Japanese, the plenipotentiary powers of the 2 envoys lacked the authority to make any decisions. All of this occurred before the fall of Weihaiwei, meaning if the delegation had been successful, the Japanese would have had a lot less chips on the table. A few days after the envoys departed for Hiroshima, the Peking Gazette, which was the official organ for the Qing government to publicate its edicts, referred to the Japanese notably not with the term Wo-ren, but this time with the term Wo-kao, which loosely means dwarf bandit. The envoys reached Hiroshima on January the 31st of 1895, and they met with Ito Hirobumi on February the 1st, with Jiang keeping a very friendly posture. Jiang continuously asked when he would be meeting with Emperor Meiji, and Ito Hirobumi kept promising soon. But he was a busy man. But in reality, the Japanese, pardon my French, were just fucking with the envoys, and they were going to toss them out of the country at any moment. Ito Hirobumi made a public statement to the 2 envoys that they lacked official seals to conclude real treaties and that Japan had demanded assurances from the Qing government they would send proper envoys with proper seals. And he finished off with this. His Majesty the Emperor of Japan conferred upon my colleague and myself full powers to conclude and sign preliminaries of peace with the plenipotentiaries of China. And thus on February the 2nd of 1895, Ito called off negotiations. Thus 2 days after the second mission arrived, they had already departed in failure. It would take over a month and a half before a third mission would leave China for Japan. And in the meantime, Japan captured Weihaiwei, destroyed the Beiyang fleet, and were now advancing upon Beijing by land and sea. This led the Chinese to stop messing around, and they chose envoys they knew the Japanese would accept. The Japanese actually made it known who they would accept, and their choices were either Liang Jang or Prince Gang, China's 2 top foreign policy experts. Now, if Liang Jang went, this offered the Japanese an enormous opportunity to humiliate the man who was commanding the Qing Navy and large parts of her land forces. The other choice placed a Manchu member of the royal clan in a position that would more than likely result in humiliation. The Qing, as you may have guessed, opted to toss the Han Chinese poor Liang Jang. It was the obvious choice to save the face of the Manchu pride, and to scapegoat as usual using a Han Chinese. A classic Qing Dynasty strategy by this point in time. Thus, the man who fought the most to modernize China and escape this entire calamity would become the scapegoat and bear China's humiliation. Honestly, Liang Jang is one of the most tragic figures in history. To ready Liang Jang for his new responsibility, Emperor Guangxu simply restored all of his honors and titles he had recently taken from him. Liang Jang yet again wore the three-eyed peacock feather and the yellow riding jacket. The Qing Imperial Court then asked all the highest-ranking provincial officials for recommendations on what to include in the peace settlement. After gathering all of these recommendations, Liang Jang was provided with this: to accept a peace settlement as long as the Japanese only wanted indemnity payments. If Japan sought any territorial concessions, the Qing would continue to fight. Might I note, all of these officials who gave the recommendations were extremely out of touch with reality, and especially on what was going on in the war. On March the 19th, Liang Jang alongside 100 other officials departed China for the port city of Shimonoseki. Premier Ito Hirobumi was the main Japanese representative, and negotiations would be conducted in English, with Liang Jang using an interpreter. Ito himself spoke English quite well. Liang Jang presented official credentials with Emperor Guangxu's seal fixed upon them. It's ironic that when presented, Premier Ito asked why the emperor used a seal but no signature, as was custom for modern society. Liang Jang waved it off, stating it was Chinese customs, and Ito did not press upon it. But yet again, it was kind of a metaphor for China's reluctance to modernize. Liang Jang began negotiations by pressing upon things the two men used to talk about. Remember, they are friends. Pan-Asianism versus Western threats. In his words, "The yellow race must work together to hamper the designs of the white race." To this, Ito replied, "When I was at Shenzhen 10 years ago settling the Korea problem, I gave you friendly advice that many reforms were most important for your country, but I regret very much that no change whatever has taken place." To that, Liang Jang sighed, and he replied, "The trammels of antiquated manners and customs in my country are most difficult to shake off, and one cannot follow one's own inclination in effecting reform." Liang Jang then argued for the signing of an alliance between China and Japan against the West, which Ito declined. Then later that day, Liang Jang presented a proposal for an armistice, which Ito also declined. Now, the main reason Ito Hirobumi was declining the armistice was because of the upcoming operations to invade Taiwan. Ito countered the armistice proposal by stating it would be accepted if the Japanese could occupy Dagu, Tianjin, and Shanhaiguan, and also if China would cede control over the railway from Tianjin to Shanhaiguan, which was her only railway at the time, and lastly to pay for the cost of such an occupation. According to Japanese Foreign Minister Mutsu Munemitsu, as Liang Jang read this memorandum to himself, his face changed color and he appeared stunned. Over and over he muttered that the terms were too severe. Liang Jang spoke with the Zhongliya men, who in turn spoke to the Qing Court in Beijing, and they all agreed to reject such an armistice agreement. On March 24th, Liang Jang warned Ito Hirobumi, "If the terms for peace involve the interests of any other country, it would be well to proceed cautiously. Your Excellency said that Japan will attack Formosa. This explains your objection to the armistice." This was basically Liang Jang threatening that Western powers would intervene if Japan sought too expensive a price for peace, and that China knew what was going on with Taiwan. As Liang Jang left that day's meeting to return to his lodgings, a Japanese youth named Koyama Toyotaro crept up to Liao Zhang's palanquin and shot him with a pistol. The bullet went right through Liang Jang's left cheek, literally just an inch below his eye. The Japanese police grabbed the man as Liang Jang was rushed to physicians to help him. The physicians were astounded with Liang Jang's fortitude in the face of such pain. especially since they could not anesthetize him due to his age. The operation would take a very long recovery time, so Liang Jang decided not to have the bullet removed, and he simply went on with the negotiations. Now you think President Theodore Roosevelt was a badass, get a load of that guy. The bullet remained lodged deep under his nose. Emperor Meiji had ordered his personal physician to attend Liang Jang with bandages rolled up personally by the Empress. Emperor Meiji followed this up with an official public apology to the Qing government. It was, of course, incumbent on us, in observation of international usage and on account of the credit of our country, to treat the Chinese ambassador with proper courtesy and consideration. Most unfortunately, however, a fanatic has come forward and inflicted injury on the Chinese ambassador. We are profoundly pained by the incident. The fanatic will, of course, be punished by our officials in conformity with law. During the following week, Liang Jang reported that he had received over 10,000 letters of condolences from the Japanese public. It was an incredible loss of face for Japan. The wannabe assassin had very publicly breached the most elementary principle of modern diplomatic conduct. That being said, the assassin received life in prison. To restore some of their loss of face, Emperor Meiji granted a 3-week armistice to China. His entire military began pulling their hair out at this. The armistice was to be partial and not general, however. What does that mean, you might be asking? Well, it meant it applied to the mainland, but not Taiwan or the Pescador Islands. The sneakiness of this was not lost on the press. The North China Herald had this to say: "This voluntary sacrifice on Japan's part is, as a matter of fact, no sacrifice and no armistice at all. The march to Peking will not be continued, but she will go on with the subjugation of Taiwan." On March the 15th of 1895, a Japanese expeditionary force of 5,500 men had set sail for the Pescador Islands. The Pescador Islands were the key to capturing Taiwan. Their occupation would prevent the Qing from sending reinforcements across the Taiwan Strait. The Pescador Islands were garrisoned by 15 Qing battalions, who held a recently created coastal defense battery that was created as a result of the French attacks during the Sino-French War. The Japanese opened up hostilities with a large naval bombardment of the Qing forts and batteries before landing ashore on Fisher Island and Pengdu on March the 24th. American-Canadian James W. Davidson was a war correspondent with the IGA during the invasion of the Pescador Islands, and later on in Taiwan. And he honestly gave one of the best accounts of the entire story. So I'm actually going to leave it to Mr. Davidson to describe how it all went down. On March the 20th, after a 5-day trip from Sasebo Naval Station, the expedition consisting of the fleet and the transports arrived off the Pescadores and anchored near Pakchao Island, to the south of the principal islands of the group. Bad weather on the 21st and the 22nd prevented an immediate attack on the forts, but on the 23rd, the storm having abated, the ships got underway, and at 9:30 a.m., upon the first flying squadron drawing near Haoqiao, the fleet subjected the Compeitai fort to heavy bombardment, to which the Chinese replied for nearly an hour before they were silenced. During the afternoon, the disembarkation of the troops commenced. By the aid of steam pinnaces, each towing several cutters, the troops consisting of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th companies of the 1st Regiment of Reserves under the command of Colonel Hashijima were all landed in less than 2 hours. The landing of the troops brought the Compeitai fort into action again, but without inflicting much damage on the Japanese. The troops on the shore engaged in a skirmish with some 300 Chinese soldiers, afterwards reinforced by 150 more, near a commanding knoll which both forces were desirous of occupying. After a few volleys from the Japanese, answered by an irregular fire from the Chinese, the latter eventually fled, leaving the position in the hands of the Japanese. Staff quarters were established in the village of Chenshan. At 2:30 on the morning of the 24th, the troops advanced with the intention of taking the Compeitai fort and Mekong, with a temporary company of mountain artillery under Captain Arai, and the naval contingent with quick-firing guns under Naval Lieutenant Tajima in the van. The night was very dark, and the only available route was so frequently cut up with ditches running in every direction that progress was laboriously slow. Only some 2 miles being made after 3 hours of painful trampling. By about 4 a.m., the Japanese force had reached the rallying ground, and 30 minutes later, led by the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Regiment of Reserves, were advancing towards the fort. The 5th Company under the command of Captain Kinoshita formed the advance guard, and the detachment of this company under command of Lieutenant Ishii were the first to engage the Chinese forces, 200 of whom had taken up a position outside the fort and appeared to dispute the advance of the Japanese. The engagement was very brief, the Chinese flying before the small number of determined Japanese. Meanwhile, the temporary battery of mountain artillery had been shelling the fort from a position too far distant to do much damage to the stronghold, but in a manner sufficiently effective to frighten out the garrison, who left in such a haste that, 30 minutes after the first gun had been fired, the Japanese were in possession. Thus was the principal port captured in the Pescadores. The naval contingent were also enabled to participate in the engagement, and with their 2 quick-firing guns, did much execution. The 4th Company of the 1st Regiment of Reserves and the naval contingent captured the village, after only a slight skirmish with the enemy. The place had been held by a garrison 500 strong. With the 2nd Company of the 1st Regiment of Reserves leading the van, the Japanese forces now reassembled and advanced on the capital and principal city of the islands, Makung. No opposition was encountered on the way, with the exception of some ineffective firing from the Yuwang Island fort. And upon reaching the city, the 1st Company stormed the Chinese infantry encampment, being followed soon after by the 2nd Company, which dashed through the gateway with the intention of dividing into 3 sections and attacking the enemy from different sides. But to their amazement, their plans were found unnecessary. The garrison, with the exception of some 30 who did not make a slight show of resistance, having fled. Some shots were fired at a few stragglers, and at 11:50 a.m., the occupation of the city was complete. Another engagement that same day resulted in the capture of the fort in the Qing Peninsula by the commander Tanji with a naval force, about 500 of the enemy surrendering without making any resistance whatsoever. 2 days later, on March the 26th, Blue Jackets occupied the Yuwang Island forts and found the place empty, the garrison having fled. Soon after the Japanese entered, a native presented himself, apparently on a very important mission, which proved to be the delivery of a letter stating that the Chinese commander and garrison wished to inform the Japanese that they surrendered the fort. Thus fell the key to southern China. The Chinese prisoners, with the exception of 8 officers, were given their liberty. The spoils of the little campaign were considerable, including 18 cannon, 2,663 rifles, over 1 million rounds of ammunition, 797 casks, and 3,173 bags of powder. There was also 1,000 bags of rice, etc., and etc. Rear Admiral Tanaka occupied the post of first governor of the group, and a government office and military post offices were once erected. Now, while the battle for the Pescadores was raging on, both sides were still undergoing negotiations. On April the 1st, Liang Jang's nephew, Li Jingfeng, met with the foreign minister Mutsu to ask if he could replace his uncle as plenipotentiary. Given the embarrassing nature of the assassination situation, Mutsu agreed to this. That same day, the Japanese handed the Qing delegation an 11-page treaty draft. The draft showed the IJN wanted Taiwan, while the IGA sought the Leong Peninsula, and the bankers wanted a large indemnity payment. One interesting point to note, Ito Hirobumi was the main architect of the treaty, and he modeled it very much on Otto von Bismarck's treaty after defeating France in 1871. Ito Hirobumi was a great admirer of Bismarck, and he even modeled the Meiji Constitution on that of Prussia. Thus, he wanted the Treaty of Shimonoseki, as it would become later known, to mirror the key features of the 1871 Treaty of Frankfurt. For those unaware, the Treaty of Frankfurt held territorial annexation, a large indemnity payment, and the occupation of an enemy city until payments were complete. Ironically, for those who know their World War history, the possession of Alsace-Lorraine would become the crux of 2 world wars. And much could be said of Japan's taking of Chinese territories, leading to the same conclusion here. The treaty draft held more than just the 3 demands, however. In totality, it included, number 1, the complete independence and autonomy of Korea. 2, the Qing cession of the entire coast region of Manchuria from the Korean border south, including the Leong Peninsula, Liang Jang, Taiwan, and the Pescador Islands. 3, the indemnity payment of 300 million taels, to be paid over 4.5 years with a 5% interest rate. 4, mandatory Japanese citizenship for residents in the ceded territories. 5, renegotiation of the Sino-Japanese commercial treaties to mirror that with the Western powers. 6, the opening of 7 cities to international commerce, residence, and industry, those being Beijing, Xiangtan, Chongqing, Wuzhou, Suzhou, Jiangsu, and Hangzhou. 7, the opening to international steam navigation of the Upper Yangtze. 8, exemption from the Laikin tax. 9, Japanese occupation of Port Arthur, Weihaiwei, and Fangtianfu, until the payments were done. And number 10, an end to all offensive military operations after the treaty signing. To sign this would spell the end of Chinese influence not only just over Korea, but major parts of Manchuria, and the complete loss of Taiwan and the Pescador Islands. When presented all of this, China agreed to the issue of Korea's independence. But when it came to all the territorial claims, Li Jingfang argued that they were far too excessive. He also argued the indemnity fee was far too high and countered with 200 taels instead. It was at this point Ito Hirobumi pulled aside Li Jingfang for an informal meeting on April the 8th. There he warned Li that time was running out, and the closer the IJA got to Beijing, the harder it would be to stop the toppling of the Qing Dynasty. Li immediately sent word back to the Qing Court, pleading for instructions on what to do. But they were not unified, with factions emerging in the court fighting over differing issues. The next day, the Qing delegation caved into some of the Japanese demands, with a few minor changes. Number 1, both Japan and China would recognize Korea's independence. 2, the territorial cessions would be just the Pescador Islands and part of Manchuria where it meets the border with Korea. This meant Andong, Guandian, Fenghuangcheng, and Xiuyanzhou. 3, the indemnity payment was reduced. 4, the Japanese would extend the same rights to Chinese in the ceded territories. 5, the new Sino-Japanese trade deals would not be unequal treaties. 6, Weihaiwei would be occupied until payments were made. 7, all future disagreements would be submitted to the international arbitration systems. And 8, all military offensives would cease upon signing. On April the 10th, Liang Jang made the first visit to Ito Hirobumi since his date with the bullet, and the talks began with a small exchange of courtesy. Liang Jang had this to say to Ito. "What you have done for Japan, I wanted to imitate for China. Had you been in my place, you would know the unspeakable difficulties met within China." Then Ito Hirobumi presented Japan's revised treaty draft, now including, number 1, Japan refused to recognize the neutrality of Korea and demanded China recognize the independence of Korea. 2, Japan agreed to limiting territorial concessions but wanted the Leong Peninsula, Liaozhuang, Taiwan, and the Pescador Islands. Number 3, the indemnity payment was just fine. 4, Japan could not guarantee Chinese property rights in the ceded territories. Number 5, Japan could not guarantee equal trade treaties. 6, Japan reduced the list of cities to be open from 7 to 4. Beijing, Xiantang, and Wuzhou were taken off. 7, Japan agreed to just occupy Weihaiwei. 8, Japan refused to accept international arbitration to resolve future disputes. And number 9, to stop military operations once the treaty was signed. The Japanese knew it would take another week or 2 for the delegation to get answers from the imperial court in Beijing, thus giving their forces more ample time to subdue the Pescadors and even Taiwan. Liang Jang began haggling some more, so Ito Hirobumi pointed out that 60 more Aegean transports were lying at anchor in Hiroshima's harbor, awaiting the armistice expiration date so they could depart for China. An ultimatum was given to the Chinese on April the 11th, and on the 15th the delegations met again where they simply hashed out the fine details such as waiving the interest rates, and they extended the armistice to Taiwan and the Pescador Islands, as by the 17th they were fully occupied. Finally, on April the 17th, the Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed. With the treaty signed, the wolves came out in China to cast blame and cannibalize Liang Jang. Liang Jang's rivals at court came after him without mercy. Liang Jang, for his part, arranged to have his nephew take on the responsibilities of handing Taiwan over to Japan. Pretty rough deal there. Now, a lot would change. The balance of power in the Far East, for example. This is a podcast about the history of China, so I do not want to delve too much into Japan. But it is important for the history of future events that you know this. Russia watched the war closely, and by the end of it came to the conclusion Japan posed a serious security threat to Russia and that of her expansion of the Far Eastern Railway system. On April the 23rd, just 6 days after the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the ministers of France, Germany, and Russia called upon the Japanese Foreign Ministry to offer some friendly advice. That friendly advice was a recommendation that Japan return the Leong Peninsula back to the Qing Dynasty on the grounds that Japan's possession of it would, quote, be a constant menace to the capital of China, would at the same time render illusory the independence of Korea, and would henceforth be a perpetual obstacle to the peace in the Far East. It was clear to the Japanese the three Western powers would intervene militarily if they did not acquiesce on the friendly advice. The Aegean was not capable of facing the three navies of France, Germany, and Russia, and thus Japan had to give up the Leong Peninsula. In truth, Russia sought a warm water port in the Pacific, as at this time they only had the cold water port of Vladivostok. As soon as Japanese forces had departed the Leong Peninsula, Russia immediately began occupying it and tossed immense funds into building up the naval base at Port Arthur. By December of 1897, Russian warships would be brought over to Port Arthur, and in March of 1898, Russia formally leased the region for 25 years from China. It might be surprising for some of you to hear, this single event would be one of the seeds that would bring about World War II. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. That little event I was talking about with Russia stealing Port Arthur from Japan, it leads to the Russo-Japanese War, which I have an episode on. Also, just a friendly reminder, I now myself have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. This month's exclusive podcast over there is part 4 of my series about General Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident and the author behind the Final War Theory. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. And so the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 has finally come to an end. It was one of the most humiliating defeats for the Qing Dynasty, and yet again was breaking it down brick by brick. After this event, the carving up of China would really ramp up.